Pause for a second, because what you're about to realize might be the final piece that explains everything you've been through. It's not that they changed. It's not that the relationship suddenly became different. It's you. You stopped chasing. No noise, no announcement, no warning. You simply stopped pouring your energy into a place that never truly gave anything back. And that seemingly small moment is what begins to shake the entire order the narcissist was used to controlling. Because they're not used to losing attention, they're addicted to it. They're not used to questioning themselves, they're used to being fed answers through your emotions. When you stop, you don't just withdraw. You unintentionally cut off the very supply they relied on to feel valuable. And what happens next is not indifference, as you might think. No. Inside them, something begins to shift, a quiet instability that grows more and more visible. They won't come running immediately. They won't easily admit it either. But they begin to realize something they've never had to face before. You are no longer within their control. And when someone who lives by controlling others realizes they can no longer control you, that's when their real behavior starts to reveal itself. This is not a story about you leaving. This is a story about what happens in their mind when for the first time they are forced to face your absence without being able to pull you back like before. Part 1. The moment they realize your silence is no longer temporary. The first moment you stop chasing doesn't create a loud explosion, no dramatic climax, no clear sign that outsiders could easily recognize. But for a narcissist, it is a shift that throws their entire perception system off balance, because they don't operate relationships through genuine connection, but through the repetition of familiar patterns, and you, with all your past patience, had unintentionally become part of that pattern. Predictable, returnable, pullable at any moment. They needed reassurance that they still had control. So when you stop, the first thing is not that they realize you've left, it's that they don't believe it's real. They assign meaning to your silence as something temporary, an emotional tactic, a reaction test. Because in their frame of reference, you are not someone who leaves definitively without signals, not someone who can step out of the cycle without explanation. And that belief delays their confrontation with reality. They continue as if everything is still under control, as if you're just pausing before returning to your usual place. But what they don't realize is that this time, there is no next phase. Your silence is not a pause, it's a cut. And the longer it lasts, the more it erodes the certainty they once had. Humans can adapt to repeated presence, but they are highly sensitive to disruptions, especially when that pattern provides emotional benefit. And in this case, the benefit was clear. They didn't have to try and still received attention. Didn't have to be clear and still kept you. Didn't have to take responsibility and still maintained the connection. So when you stop, you're not just withdrawing from a relationship, you're removing a psychological structure they depended on. And that absence begins to create a kind of cognitive interference. At first, it's subtle, almost negligible, just a vague sense that something isn't right. But then it repeats, day after day. No new messages, no familiar reactions, no signs that you're still there in the way you used to be. At that point, they begin to shift from passive to intentional attention, not because they've suddenly become deeper, but because their mind is trying to restore lost stability. They start recalling recent interactions not to understand you, but to find an irregularity that explains the change. They scan small details they once ignored, not because those details mattered, but because now they're all they have left without new input. And this process marks a crucial shift. Before, their attention toward you was automatic. Now it becomes effort. Before, they received without giving. Now they're forced to think about why they're no longer receiving. This creates a paradox they are not used to facing. The less they receive, the more attention they must give. Not because you suddenly became more valuable, but because your absence breaks a long-established expectation. And when expectations break, the human mind tries to fill the gap with questions. But these questions are not constructive as you might think. They don't begin with, "What did I do?" They revolve around, "What happened to you?" Because turning inward requires a level of self-awareness not everyone is willing to have, especially those who are used to maintaining a sense of control. So they hold on to their old perspective as long as possible. But the longer they hold it, the greater the misalignment between reality and belief becomes. And that misalignment creates a kind of internal discomfort they cannot easily name. They may not say it, they may not show it, but they begin to check more, observe more, not because they've changed, but because they can no longer rely on you to maintain the old state. And this is the true starting point of a shift that you don't need to influence any further. Because once you have truly stopped, the process unfolds on its own quietly, without drama, but deep enough to destabilize any structure that was built on one-sided dependence. Part 2. The quiet confusion when the old script no longer works. The confusion doesn't arrive instantly as a clear shock. It seeps in slowly, quietly, like a subtle misalignment they cannot quite name, because the entire script they were used to using with you suddenly stops working the way it used to. And what disorients them is not the fact that you left, but that they cannot understand why what once worked has now become meaningless. Before, they operated the relationship through predictable responses from you. They knew when you would text, when you would come back after an argument, when you would soften, and that repetition gave them a strong sense of control, a kind of control that required no effort, yet always remained intact. But when you stop chasing, you don't just change your behavior, you break the entire predictive structure they built in their mind. And this places them in a very specific state. They have no new data to understand the situation, yet the old data no longer applies. When a person is caught between two cognitive systems like this, the natural reaction is not acceptance, but an attempt to patch reality by forcing explanations that still fit their old beliefs. So they begin to reassure themselves that your change is temporary, that you'll return soon, that everything will go back to the way it was. But the longer they wait, the more reality refuses to match their expectations. And that mismatch creates a kind of internal tension they are not used to facing. Because they've never had to question the stability of this relationship. They've never had to consider that their position in your life could shift without their permission. And now, for the first time, they are confronted with the possibility they cannot control that you may have truly changed. And when that thought begins to surface, even faintly, it immediately triggers a chain of reactions. They start reviewing what happened, not to gain deeper understanding, but to find a fault point that explains your shift. They revisit conversations, moments that once seemed insignificant, trying to assign them new meaning, as if identifying a logical cause could restore the old order. But the problem is, there is no single cause that can explain your change. Because your shift didn't come from one event, but from an accumulation they never paid attention to. And that only deepens their confusion. Because they cannot fix something they don't understand, and they certainly cannot control something that no longer responds in familiar ways. This is where a paradox begins to form in their mind. The more they try to understand, the more they realize they don't. The more they cling to what's familiar, the more it feels wrong. And this begins to shake a core belief they once relied on, that they could always read you, always predict you, always pull you back when needed. But now, you no longer respond according to any pattern they recognize. And that strips them of one of their most important tools, control through familiarity. And when that tool no longer works, they are forced to face a reality they don't like. They no longer hold the narrative the way they thought they did. This confusion is not surface level. It goes deeper. It begins to affect how they see themselves within the relationship. Because if they can no longer control you, then who are they in this story? That question may never be spoken out loud, but it lingers as a quiet pressure. It prevents them from fully returning to their old state, yet it is not enough to push them into real change. So they become stuck between holding on to old beliefs and being forced to confront a new reality. And this state of being stuck is what destabilizes them the most, because it offers no clear direction, no familiar role, and most importantly, It forces them to remain in a situation they cannot immediately resolve. For someone who is used to controlling outcomes, being trapped in uncertainty is one of the most uncomfortable experiences they can face. Part 3. They start watching you, but don't dare to approach. They don't disappear from your life the way you once thought. On the contrary, they begin to exist in a very different way, quieter, more hidden, but more focused than ever. Because when you no longer provide direct reactions, they are forced to shift into a form of indirect access to maintain a sense of connection and control. At this stage, you won't see them clearly, but that doesn't mean they aren't there. They observe, they monitor, they pay attention to the smallest signals you leave behind. Not because they suddenly care about you in a deeper way, but because they are trying to gather information in a situation where they no longer have direct access like before. This creates a very specific state. They want to know what you're doing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, but they don't want to be the one to step forward and ask. Because initiating contact would mean admitting they are no longer in control. And for someone used to being in the position of receiving, having to step forward directly hits their ego. So they choose another route. They stay at a safe distance far enough to avoid confrontation, but close enough to observe. And within that distance, they begin analyzing everything in their own way. A story you post, a status you share, a small change in your online habits, everything becomes data they try to decode. Not to truly understand you, but to answer one question in their mind: are you still within their influence or not? And what's notable is that the less direct response they get from you, the more they rely on indirect assumptions. And those assumptions are easily shaped by the insecurity they don't want to admit. They may convince themselves that you're still thinking about them, that you're just pretending to be strong, that you'll come back soon. But at the same time, another part of them begins to consider possibilities they've never faced before, that you might actually be fine without them, that you might be living a life that no longer revolves around them. And the coexistence of these two thought streams creates an internal tension. They're not certain enough to act, but not detached enough to let go. As a result, they become stuck in the role of an observer, someone who doesn't participate directly, but invests a significant amount of energy into watching. And this is the paradox. When you were there, they may not have truly paid attention to you. But when you withdraw, they begin paying more attention than ever. Not because you suddenly became more emotionally important, but because you became more unpredictable in terms of control. And for them, what cannot be predicted always attracts more attention than what is familiar. However, no matter how much they observe, they cannot recreate the sense of certainty they once had, because observing from a distance can never replace direct control. And this is what places them in a very specific state. They know you are there, they see you continuing your life, but they can no longer influence it the way they used to. And this forces them to face a reality they don't like, that you are no longer an adjustable part of their world. But instead of fully accepting that, they remain in a gray zone, watching, guessing, waiting for a signal from you. A signal small enough not to damage their ego, but clear enough for them to return without admitting they lost control. And this waiting prolongs the tension, because it doesn't lead to any decisive action. It keeps them suspended in between moving forward and stepping back, between letting go and holding on. And while they remain there, you, if you continue to hold your silence, are moving in a completely different direction. A direction they can no longer keep up with. Not because you are doing anything extraordinary, but because you have stopped participating in the very game they understood best. And when that game no longer exists, all their familiar strategies lose meaning, leaving them in a role they are not used to. Someone who can only watch, but cannot touch, can only guess, but cannot be certain. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult for them to walk away. Because they still feel that something is unfinished, yet they don't know what to do to complete it without losing the image they have always tried to protect. Part 4. The ego begins to shake when the mirror disappears. The real breaking point is not when you leave, but the moment they begin to feel that the thing which once reflected their value you is no longer reflecting anything back. Because before, they never had to look inward to know who they were. They only had to look at how you reacted, how you cared, how you returned after being hurt. From that, they built an image of themselves they believed was real, an image constantly reinforced by your presence, like a mirror always positioned at the perfect angle, always reflecting the light they wanted to see. But when you stop, when you no longer provide those familiar reactions, that mirror stops working the way it used to. And what happens is not that they immediately recognize the change, but that they begin to feel a kind of absence they cannot name, because they were never aware that the value they felt about themselves depended so heavily on how you saw them. And when that reflection disappears, they no longer have an external source confirming that they are still important, still influential, still at the center of your story. That absence forces them to face a void they had always avoided, a void not created by you, but one that had always existed, simply covered by the attention and emotion you continuously provided. Once that cover is removed, they begin to feel instability in how they perceive themselves. They may not put it into words, but it shows up as vague questions, subtle discomfort, moments where they wonder why everything no longer feels in place as it once did. And what unsettles them the most is not your absence, but the fact that they no longer feel certain about their own image without you. Because if before they could rely on your reactions to confirm their value, now without those reactions, they are forced to confront the possibility that this value was never as stable as they believed. This is a critical point, because it doesn't just affect how they see you, it affects how they see themselves. When someone has grown used to maintaining a stable self-image through external reflection, losing that reflection creates a form of internal imbalance. They may try to restore the old feeling by recalling what once was, by convincing themselves that you are still thinking about them, that your silence is temporary, that everything will eventually return to how it used to be. But those efforts can only last for so long, because reality no longer provides any evidence to support that belief. And as the gap between belief and reality widens, the internal tension grows with it. At this point, they begin to enter a state they are not familiar with, a state they cannot easily regulate using old strategies, because those strategies all depended on your reactions. And when you no longer react, they no longer have a point of leverage to activate them. This forces them into a choice they do not like. Either they turn inward to understand what is happening, or they seek another source of reflection to replace you. And in many cases, they will lean toward the second option, because finding an external source is far easier than confronting the internal void. But no matter which path they choose, one truth remains unchanged. You no longer play the same role in their psychological system. You are no longer a mirror that easily reflects the image they want to see. And that changes everything about how they experience this relationship. Because without that familiar reflection, they can no longer maintain the illusion of control in the same way. And when that illusion begins to crack, what follows is not immediate clarity, but a slow, quiet process, where they are forced to face the truth that what they once believed was stable only existed because of your continuous participation. And when you withdraw, that entire structure can no longer sustain itself, leaving them with a question they cannot easily answer. Without you reflecting them, who are they really in their own story? Part 5. Curiosity turns into anxiety when they are no longer certain of their place. The shift from curiosity to anxiety does not happen as a sudden drop, but more like a quiet pressure that gradually builds in their mind. At first, they still believe your change is temporary, that everything will eventually return to its old course. But as time passes, without any sign that you are still operating within familiar patterns, the certainty they once relied on begins to weaken. And when that certainty fades, what appears first is not acceptance, but a kind of unease that is difficult to name, because they have never had to face losing their position in your life in this way. They may have left others before, pulled people back, controlled the rhythm of many relationships, but this time they are no longer in that position. And this reversal leaves them unsure of where they stand in the story, Because if before they were the center around which you revolved, now, when you no longer revolve around them, they are forced to face the possibility that they are no longer as important as they once believed. And this doesn't just affect the relationship between you and them, it affects how they see themselves. Because for them, personal value is not built internally, but from how others respond to them. And when that response is no longer there, they lose one of their most important sources of validation. This loss creates a form of unstable anxiety, not a clear fear that can be named, but a lingering sense of no longer being certain about their place. They begin to ask questions, but these are not deeply self-reflective questions, they are positional. They don't ask, "What did I do to cause this change?" but rather, "Why am I no longer getting the same reactions?" That difference is crucial, because it shows they are still viewing the situation through the lens of control, not connection. And when they cannot find a satisfying answer, they begin to construct hypotheses to fill the gap. They may convince themselves that you are just pretending to be strong, that you still care but don't want to show it, that you will return once your emotions settle. But alongside those assumptions, another line of thought begins to emerge, slower but more persistent, that you may have truly changed, that you may actually be fine without them. And the existence of this possibility prevents them from fully settling into their old beliefs. As these two streams of thought coexist, they fall into an internal conflict. They are not certain enough to let go, but not confident enough to approach directly. As a result, they remain stuck in an ambiguous space, watching, guessing, waiting for a signal from you to confirm that they still have a place. In this state, every small detail from you can become amplified in meaning. A period of inactivity, a shift in how you present yourself, a sign that you seem more stable, all of it becomes potential evidence in their reasoning system. Not to understand you, but to determine where they still fit in the picture. And what unsettles them the most is not that you might leave completely, but that they no longer control the narrative. They no longer know what the next move will be, no longer know how you would respond if they reached out. This unpredictability weakens the sense of power they once had. Because for them, power is not only the ability to influence, but also the ability to predict and direct the behavior of others. And when that ability is gone, they are forced to face a reality they are not used to, that they are not always the one deciding how the relationship unfolds. This realization creates a growing psychological pressure, because it doesn't just challenge how they see you, it challenges how they see themselves. And when someone who has always defined their value through control begins to lose that ability, what emerges is not immediate understanding, but a quiet, lingering anxiety. One that prevents them from fully returning to their old state, but is not yet enough to make them change their approach. And it is precisely this in-between state that holds them the longest. Because it offers no clear conclusion, only the feeling that something is slipping out of their hands, and they don't know what to do to hold on to it, without sacrificing the image they have always tried to protect. Part 6. Testing behaviors. They will try to pull a reaction from you. Their next actions will never appear as clear or sincere as you once hoped. Because when they realize you no longer respond the way you used to, they don't immediately change their nature, they change their strategy. And that strategy is not about genuinely reconnecting, but about testing whether you are still within their sphere of influence. That's why every reappearance during this stage carries an experimental quality, subtle, hard to detect, light enough to protect their ego, yet enough to create a small stimulus in you. They may send a vague message, not directly addressing anything, just an innocent question, a faint reference to the past, or a carefully measured expression of concern that avoids outright rejection. But beneath it is not a desire to understand you, it's a measurement, a way to determine whether you still react. Because to them, your reaction has always been the most important signal. It doesn't just tell them how you feel, it tells them where they still stand in your world. And if you respond even slightly, even politely, even with the smallest sign, they won't focus on the content of your reply. They focus on the fact that a response exists. From that, they draw one conclusion. The door is not fully closed. That they still have the ability to return if they choose. And that conclusion allows them to maintain their old approach without any deeper change. Because in their mind, if the old strategy still works to some extent, there is no reason to confront the more difficult parts of themselves. So they continue testing, adjusting intensity, maybe gentle at first, then more direct, sometimes even lightly provocative to see if you react emotionally. Because any reaction, whether positive or negative, can be used as proof that they still have influence. And what's crucial to understand here is that these actions do not come from internal transformation. They come from a need to restore a lost sense of control. They don't show up to rebuild the relationship in a healthier way. They show up to check whether the old system still functions. If you engage again, even partially, you are providing them with the exact data they need to keep operating the same way. But if you do not respond, if you maintain your silence not as a tactic, but as a natural state of no longer being pulled in, then all their tests begin to lose effectiveness. And this is where they are forced to face something they cannot control through surface-level actions. The reality that they cannot always pull things back on their terms. When their tests repeatedly receive no response, they enter a state far more uncomfortable than the initial confusion, because now they can no longer reassure themselves that everything is temporary. They begin to realize that you haven't just changed your behavior, you've changed their position in your life. And that shift cannot be reversed by a single message or a simple action. This realization creates a new kind of pressure, one that forces them to choose between continuing to invest in strategies that no longer work, or accepting that they have lost an important source of influence. For many, the second option is extremely difficult. So they may try a few more times, in different ways, hoping that at some point you will react. But if you remain as you are, not through effort, but through clarity, that you no longer belong to that cycle, then all those testing attempts eventually lose meaning. Not because you resisted them, but because you no longer provide the conditions for those strategies to exist. And when a strategy no longer has the conditions to operate, it doesn't need to be destroyed, it simply ends on its own, leaving them with a reality they cannot avoid. This time, you are no longer reacting. And this is not a phase, it is a real change. Part 7. If you remain silent, they begin to face the truth. When you continue to remain silent, not the kind of silence filled with suppression or an attempt to appear strong, but a silence that comes from no longer being emotionally bound as you once were, what begins to happen is not external, but deep within their mind. Because all their previous testing strategies no longer produce any response, and when someone who has always operated through the reactions of others no longer receives those reactions, they are forced to confront a void they have long avoided. That void is not simply your absence, but the absence of a continuous source of validation, something that once allowed them to avoid questioning themselves. And when that source is gone, they can no longer maintain their old state by adjusting external behavior. They begin to enter an internal process of confrontation. Not always consciously, but enough to shift how they experience the situation. They may start to feel that something is missing, something they never noticed before. Not because you suddenly became more special, but because your presence once played a stabilizing role in part of their emotional system. And when that part disappears, they are left to process what remains without the familiar support. This is where the difference between real emotion and habit begins to reveal itself. If what they felt for you had more depth than they realized, your absence will make that clearer, not through dramatic emotional surges, but through a gradual recognition that something meaningful has disappeared from their life. They may begin to think of you differently, not as someone who was always there, but as someone who once truly mattered. And this shift in perception doesn't come from anything you say, but from the fact that you are no longer there to sustain the old image. But if what they felt was mostly based on convenience and habit, then your absence leads to a different outcome. The emotion doesn't intensify. It fades. Not because you lost value, but because there is no longer any energy from you to sustain the intensity of the connection. And this too is a form of confrontation, because it forces them to see that what they believed was connection may not have been as deep as they thought. Either way, the process shares one common point. They can no longer avoid looking inward, because there is no longer external interaction to distract them. They can no longer rely on your reactions to define their own emotional state. They must determine for themselves what truly exists in the absence of your participation. And this is not a comfortable process. Because it requires a level of honesty they are not always willing to face. One part of them may want clarity, may want to understand, but another part longs to return to the old state where everything was simpler, where they didn't have to confront difficult questions. This internal conflict creates a sustained pressure, quiet but powerful enough to influence their next actions. They may hesitate, take a step forward, and then pull back, consider reaching out but never follow through, because any action now carries greater risk than before. If they reach out and you don't respond, it confirms they've lost their position. But if they do nothing, they must continue living with uncertainty. And this choice between two uncomfortable states removes them from their previous sense of safety. They are no longer the one fully controlling the narrative. They become someone reacting to a reality they cannot shape. And within this process, the truth gradually becomes clearer, not because you explain it, but because nothing is left to cover it anymore. Your silence does not create the truth, it removes what once hid it. And when those layers are gone, what remains is the true nature of the relationship and of themselves. Whether they choose to face it or continue avoiding it, they cannot return to complete unawareness as before. Because once the void has been recognized, even partially, it remains as something unresolved. And that is what marks a change they cannot fully reverse. Not because you did something to them, but because you stopped doing what once kept everything functioning the way it used to.